Hello, and welcome to the Authentic Role-Playing Podcast, featuring independent DMs and GMs of tabletop role-playing games. My name is Alexis Smolensk, and I'm coming to you from Calgary, Alberta, in Western Canada, where I had a tooth filled just 7 hours ago. Today I'm talking to Sterling Blake, who comes to us from Maine on the eastern seaboard. He tells me he's run house-modified versions of AD&D, 2nd, 3rd, and 5th editions over the past 36 years. Hello, Sterling. How are you?
Hi, Alexi. I'm well, thanks.
That's great. You glad to be here?
Very glad to be here. Thank you.
Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the podcast, I'll just explain that we're ordinary, everyday role players. We're not celebrities. We're not experts. We're just people running our own games. Some of my guests have been doing this for a long time, and some are just starting. So, how old were you when you started gaming, Sterling?
Let's see. It was 81 or so. So I guess I was about 12 when I started, and I started out with the basic edition, the Moldvay version. So that was I think that came out in January of 81. I think I got a hold of it in June of 81. That was my first experience, and my younger brother and I dug right in. Very shortly after getting into basic, we picked up the expert set, which was, how do I say it? It gave us a better understanding of the rules as we'd played them so far. We'd actually gotten up a few levels beyond 3rd, if you remember the old basic version, basic D&D. It was rules for levels 1 through 3, and then the expert set provide rules for levels 4 through 7 or something like this.
Yeah, I owned it at some point.
Right. Well, if you look at the experience point values, looking at just the first 3 levels, the data points, it's not clear that that's a geometric progression rather than a linear progression. So
yeah,
we had developed characters up to 12th level with enough experience to technically be like 5th level. So that was the first misstep, but quickly corrected. So
did you start DMing right away, or did your brother?
I did. So I was the older brother. So and I had the rules. So I started out as the DM, but we certainly traded back and forth quite a bit. I think we both enjoy both sides of the table. My brother might actually enjoy the DM side of it more than I do, but we both play it to this day.
To this day.
Yeah, no longer the basic and expert editions, but definitely still playing together.
Well, we should get some sort of handle on this. When did you realize you were still going to be playing the game in 36 years?
About 36 years later, I guess you could say. Right. So yeah, backing up just a little bit, what drove us to get the D&D rules, I think that it was, I can't remember now if it was actually a gift from my parents or if I, begged them into buying it for me or something. But I had first heard about the game a year or two before on the radio. I was living in Tokyo, Japan at the time. My father was stationed out there at an air base. And there was a public service announcement that came on the one English radio station, which was broadcasting from the base. And it was the announcer was talking about a game of Dungeons and Dragons that was going to be played at the base library, and it was sort of inviting people to come and see what it was all about and so forth. But the radio announcer couldn't quite wrap his head around the words in the announcement. The words game of Dungeons and Dragons just didn't fit for him. He couldn't understand what the announcement was trying to be. So he kind of stumbled through it for several minutes, and then finally at the end of that, after finally spitting it all out, said, "If anybody understood what I just said, please call me." So, but that was the first time I'd heard about the game, and I was intrigued, to say the least. So
we've both been doing this for a long time, so we know that saying, I mean, I think everybody does, but I think we've had a lot of experience with saying the words Dungeons and Dragons and watching the response that we get from people who have never heard of it or perhaps have heard only a little about it.
Right,
have you
right. Of
had
course,
any?
this time I'm talking about was 79 or 80, so even fewer people at that time had heard.
Well, you've been playing for a long time, so how has your game influenced other things in your life?
Yeah, I can certainly probably speak more to how things outside gaming have influenced the gaming. My professional life has influenced it to a degree, maybe to a fairly large degree. I've spent a number of years. My early career was as a software engineer, but then the later part of my career was in management consultancy. So I spent a fair amount of time managing people, but also sort of structuring how business worked and how to manage people. That provided some insights that were useful at the table, tactically with a group of players, but even kind of strategically ahead of time, sort of planning out how things might go. So it gave me a sort of, I guess, a project manager's view of how the game could be delivered.
Has that worked in the other direction? Has the game occasionally given you insight into project manager work?
No, I don't. I don't think so. None that I've benefited from anyway. I think early on the game was had more influence, sort of going out into the rest of my life. I think starting at age 12, this was a game that was not really designed for children, and I went quite quickly into AD&D, at age 13 or 14, and that was even less so geared toward the younger audience. I extended my vocabulary, for one thing, fairly dramatically. So sort of from the game going out, I guess that's what I've seen from a professional standpoint, not so much.
Well, feel free to speak about your brother here, because I'm sure you both discussed your issues at length. But what would you say are your biggest issues as a DM?
Well, there are different things that we're looking for, I think, going in as DMs and as players. Different things that we're comfortable providing as DMs and different things that we want to get back from the game as players. And I think that we adapt well to each other's style. And I'll say that even more broadly than just myself and my brother. We have kind of a core group of a couple of other guys, so there are 5 of us in sort of the central core, and a couple more who are more in and out. But all of us have different styles, and we all kind of trade around the duties a bit. My brother and I probably spend more time at the DM side of it, but we all take our turns. And we have some different styles. So I think my brother he's more of an actor. So he does a bit more direct role play as opposed to the sort of third person indirect that I tend to lean a little bit more on when I'm at the head of the table. So that's a delivery style difference. And then from a content style difference, I tend to provide more of a maybe grittier, sort of lower powered, simulation oriented style of presenting the world and what's in it, and I think that probably in my group I'm most in that direction, and then others sort of work back toward the storytelling end of the spectrum. But we all adapt to each other's style quite well.
Let me try to put the question in a different way. What would you say are your shortcomings when it comes to DMing?
Well, I have shortcomings in every aspect of DMing.
You want to name a few?
Sure. So, right off the bat, like I said, I'm not much of an actor. So dramatic presentation is not something that I do well, and therefore I mostly avoid doing. So I would tend to describe NPC actions in the third person as opposed to taking on the voice and facial expression and so on of an NPC in a social interaction, let's say. I would more tend to describe what they're seeing and describe how that NPC is acting. So that I think is a shortcoming. I think that I would have a stronger presence as a DM if I was able to get insert a little more drama through acting. Other shortcomings. It's a lot to manage. As you know, there are lots of moving parts, particularly in the style of play that I like to present, which is, as I say, kind of gritty and simulation oriented. there are lots of facts that I sort of need to keep track of, and I like to have a lot of things sort of going on that may or may not intersect with the players. They have to be ready for the players to intersect with them. So I'll, well, in the most recent session, I had a schedule of what the patrols of this particular enemy were doing, where they were, when, and what their pattern of behavior was on a typical day. But then in the moment of delivering the game, I shifted between two patrols accidentally. And so I had the wrong patrol in the wrong place at the wrong time, and then had to sort of on the fly adjust, okay, well, that's what this patrol was doing, and then sort of rejigger everything else around it to make it all fit.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's doable. But again, I think if I were a little more capable of keeping myself in line, then I wouldn't have to sort of scramble like that.
I think we all scramble like that to some degree. Do you think maybe some of your players might be made more comfortable by moving into the third person as opposed to role-playing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that probably my brother and I are at the most extreme ends within our group in that regard, and the other guys sort of fall at various points in between. I think probably two of the other three land pretty close to me, and one of them lands closer to my brother. But we're all somewhere along that spectrum. And as I say, we've all known each other for a very long time. One guy was my neighbor across the street when we were in high school. Obviously, I've known my brother his entire life. A third guy was just down the street from us when we were in high school, and the other guy I've known, since. Well, his wife was my wife's best friend in high school. So we're all, so we've got fairly long history together.
So you're not speaking about a lot of different players that have been in your game. You can talk to actual people who have been playing your game for 20 years. So
right.
Okay, so just looking at the perspective of the time that's passed, how would you describe one of your players' experiences in your world, say 20, 25 years ago, compared to how it is now?
Yeah, so certainly much improved. I think the level of play that my brother and I were engaged in, let's say 25 years ago. Let me think about when 25 years ago was. No, let's say closer to even closer to 30 years ago, because there was a period in there where I wasn't with those guys. The simple answer is our styles have matured a lot, but specifically, I think that we've shifted from a sort of make your characters as powerful as you possibly can and go kill some gods to a more of a let's explore this interesting situation. As players figure out what's going on, as DMs create something that has some interest and something to really dig into, as opposed to more of almost a board game way of playing the game. I think when we were first doing it.
You've calmed down.
Yeah, that's yeah. Calm down.
You've calmed down. You've matured.
And what we're interested in doing with it has, as I say, changed. Right. So we're no longer about trying to make a character as powerful as it possibly can be and try to find a +5 holy avenger, or all the other paraphernalia that as a 13-year-old boy you're like, oh, I got to get one of them. That's kind of gone away now.
Well, I would propose that that's pretty normal. Do you think that's a normal turn of events?
That would be my guess. Yeah, I would think so too. I mean, my circle of players is not that wide. So I've never played at a convention. I have never played in a game store with strangers. So I don't have that sort of broad perspective on how other people in general play it. I really just have this sort of narrow circle of friends.
After all this time, I'm sure you have a pretty good structure underlying your campaign, yes?
Yeah, I mean, so actually, what we're playing now is kind of a brand new campaign. So within just the past few months, I think we started this up in November. But certainly, I can speak to campaigns that I have run for 20 plus years. I can speak to campaigns that I've played in for 10 plus years.
Well, I'm sure you're still pirating the same ideas, the same general principles, the same direction of structure that when you think about organizing a given town or a given setting, you're still drawing on a lot of experience.
Absolutely, I'm using a lot of techniques and actually able to recycle unused material from decades ago. So at one time I went on a kick of building dozens of towns and cities that no player has ever visited. So I have these things in my back pocket. And okay, now I'm going to need to have a town in this new campaign. What are these most closely fits the profile? Can I use any of this older material and sort of bring it forward? So yeah, that's helpful too.
Okay, well, speaking as a one-time software engineer, how have you augmented that structure?
Well, I guess there are a couple of things that I have tweaked, and the mechanics of the rules are something that I find interesting and frustrating and worth messing around with. And so I have spent a fair amount of time experimenting with different rules, different ways of doing things. Comparing, AD&D to second edition to third edition to fifth, to other ways of approaching things like fudge, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I like I like the way certain parts of the mechanic in fudge work. It sort of makes things work on a normal curve in terms of the distribution of abilities, but also where one's execution of a skill would land. And so you would tend to perform. You would strongly tend to perform at the level that you are competent with a given skill, as opposed to the sort of flat probability curve that a single die gives you, from 1 to 20, let's say. We work with a more normal curve. So I've kind of messed around with the mechanics, probably more so than the content, at least on a conscious level. The content of the campaign and how that works, I don't know how well I can articulate it. It's a more intuitive process for me than the mechanical part of it. And I know it's evolved over the years, and I know I'm presenting things differently and thinking about things differently, but I'm not sure how well I can articulate what those changes specifically are.
There's a lack of description in that kind of thing. I should ask you though. Well, why the move from AD&D to second to third to fifth? How did that progress? Were you looking for something?
I wouldn't say so, and it was different in each case. So going from first to second, the second edition rules I think came out in '89 or '90, right about then. Which at that time I was in college and not actively playing. So I didn't actually pick them up until a year or two later. And then it was mostly out of curiosity. And to me, the second edition is really the same game as AD&D. It was not a dramatic change. There were some tweaks. I think, the non-weapon proficiencies was kind of the biggest piece of what second edition brought. And it was something that spoke to me in particular because I'd always used the secondary skills that were in that were sort of an optional rule in AD&D, but felt them inadequate and always wanted to go deeper with sort of the rest of what would round out a character's skill set. So the non-weapon proficiencies that were presented in second edition really drew me to that edition, and that was why I shifted to that edition.
Yeah.
Third edition, I shifted to 2000, I think, when this came out. And at that time, the reason I shifted is I had a friend who had the third edition rules, and that's what he wanted to DM, and I wanted to play with him. So I bought the third edition rules. I hated them. I really despised the rule set, but went along because I wanted to play with this group of friends, and came to really enjoy the D20 mechanic for quite some time. I've now come back around to disliking the way that works, and especially the steep power curve that it has sort of intrinsic to it.
Yeah.
But anyway, that was the rationale for switching to third. I never touched fourth. I never had a reason to. I think I was barely aware of it coming out. I don't even remember when it was released, but it must have been around 2008, 2007, somewhere in that time frame. I never had an incentive to look at it. And as I say, I barely knew it had happened. When fifth edition came out, again, I was excited. The novelty of it excited me, and I was curious. It wasn't a huge investment to pick up the 3 core rule books. At that stage in my life, I wasn't terribly strapped for cash, and I was really curious. I loved the game, and I said, well, let's take a look and see if see how it is. And it quite appealed to me. And it was a bit of a throwback toward earlier editions in a lot of ways. It certainly undid a lot of what third edition changed. It sort of brought it back to something closer to the first and second editions of the game, which I played almost as the same game anyway.
Right.
And that's what I'm using in my current campaign that I'm running. Although I continue to sort of tweak the rules and ignore other rules, and I think that I sort of settled on second is really my favorite. So next time I'm in a position of having to pick a rule set, that's probably going to be the one. But I don't play a whole lot exactly by the book anyway, so the rules don't necessarily have to be that tightly defined. And I think in our game group we all have that same sort of style that the DM's in charge, and none of us are going to sit there and argue about how a rule ought to be interpreted. When there's a ruling, if there's some disagreement about how it's supposed to work, it's a very quick, oh, is it that way or is it this way? And if it's something quick, we might look it up to decide, or more likely we'll say, well, we're just calling it A for now. We'll figure it out later. Maybe we'll use B going forward after that, but right now it's A.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do that a lot myself, putting things off. Now, thinking about the future, are you satisfied with where you are right now, or do you see something bigger on your horizon that you're moving towards?
Yeah, definitely something bigger I'm moving towards. So I'm always, as I said, kind of messing around with the mechanics, and I think this actually might go for more than another game that I play than it does for D&D. The other game that we play in this group pretty heavily is Traveler. Which was released as D&D in space. I think was the design intent back in 1977 or whenever it came out.
Oh, I played it extensively. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Similarly, there have been a lot of versions of that. There's been Mega Traveler and Mongoose Traveler and Mark Miller's Traveler and T5, and so there have been several editions. I think you might count 7 editions of this, depending on how you look at it. I never really moved off of classic. There were some rules that were introduced in some of the supplements, the little black books beyond the basic rules, that just sort of extended parts of character generation, and we've stuck with that. And I think the only thing I would do is, as I tweak it, and I've recently been messing around with this on paper, just sort of thinking it through, is to maybe fudgeify the action resolution for skills. But otherwise, I think the mechanics they're just what they need to be, which is quite simple, and it leaves a lot of work for the DM, I suppose. But it also makes it so we're not spending half an hour trying to figure out whether a 16 is a hit or a miss. So
Okay, well, let's take a break. How's the podcast going so far?
Good. I think I'm hoping I'm generating enough interesting stuff here. I'm not sure how much I said that anybody would be particularly interested in, but it's been a fun conversation.
It's what I've said, though, is that I think that people are interested in hearing something that comes from themselves, right? there's so much content that's out there that's quite clearly designed to be content.
Yeah, right.
And there's not much content that is just people, ordinary people, just talking about ordinary things and their ordinary experiences. We have that from a personal, like if I go to a game store or some such, I can have that momentary experience. But with a lot of different people hearing a given podcast, I think that there's an opportunity there for people going, I'm like that too, or I have that problem too, or that's why I did that, or so on and so forth. And I think that it doesn't necessarily matter whether or not it's officially exciting, because I think that I think that what we like is exciting enough, and just talking about what we like and then hearing other people talk about it, I think that's more than enough for somebody to be interested in listening to a podcast.
Okay, I think you're, well, turning it around, I think you're probably right, because I know I'm interested in hearing how some of these other interviews go and hearing what other people say about how they play the game. As I said, I've always played in a very narrow circle, so my experience is long, but not broad.
But I kind of like everybody to have a clear and untouched experience, so that they're not thinking about what somebody else said on a different podcast, and then bring them all out as a group.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Why did you decide to do the podcast?
I had been reading your blog. I just started reading your blog this past fall, and I think I mentioned this in an email to you at some point, that I'd stumbled across it looking for something. I was researching something on the new campaign that I wanted to start rolling, and I was interested in figuring out some of the economics. I was looking at creating a realistic alternate version of 10th century Earth or 11th century Earth, and wanted to get some rough idea of what crop yields were, and how much hay does it take to feed a cow, and just some sort of basic ground this in reality, so that and I guess we all probably have some degree of intuitive feel for this, that in medieval times, obviously agriculture production was lower per acre than it is now, but just how much was it? 3/4? Was it half? Was it
numbers I've seen have suggested that the actual yield was 1.3 per bushel, right? That if you planted a bushel of seed, you could expect to get 1 1/3 bushels back.
That's pretty weak.
That's prior to the horse cart. That's prior to the horse collar. That's prior to everything, right? That's 10th, 11th century English planting.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which makes you wonder what you probably ought to just go fishing.
Well, even 1/3 back, right? I mean, that's still more food than you're putting in. And if I suggested that, if you put in $1,000 into the bank, I can give you a 33% yield in 5 months, right? You would certainly go for that kind of return.
That's true. Absolutely. If it was a bushel of pennies, I had to stick them all into the ground by hand, and I could dig up 130% of that many pennies 5 months later. I don't know if I'd actually go for that.
Well, thank God they were willing, or none of us would be here.
So anyway, sorry, I've veered off the topic here. So you were asking how it was that I came to
do the podcast,
to answer the call when you said, "Hey, I'm looking for people to go to the interview." So I'd started reading your blog, doing some kind of crazy foolish research, and happened across your something that you'd written. I don't remember what it was that first caught me. But then started, digging in, because a lot of what you were saying resonated with me, and a lot of it kind of pissed me off, and I disagreed with, and I wanted to understand where you're coming from with it. So anyway, this is maybe, I don't know, a month before one of your posts was, putting out a call for, hey, I'm doing this podcast with DMs, want to hear what everybody's experience is, and I felt like I'd been taking and not giving, so I ought to. I'll share what I do have, and maybe some of it will be useful for somebody.
Sure. Now, you were talking about Traveler, right? The trade system.
Yes.
The trade system that I eventually launched for my game, and then later, that I've put on that I put online. That trade system came out of Traveller, probably
Oh yeah,
more than
okay. So
anything, right? I mean, I didn't copy the Traveller system, but between my starting to play Traveller in about 1980 and my getting my first ideas of how to build a trade system for D&D, which was about 1986, 87, I
yeah,
spent those 6 or 7 years beating my head trying to make the trade system actually work for Traveller, and trying to work for Traveller, and trying to work for Traveller, and it never really did. I love the idea of it, but as a
right.
system, it was horrible. And I remember
Yeah,
we
yeah.
we took this poor guy was running a game, and we just showed him in the worst possible way that we could jury rig the system so easily, and we made tens of millions of credits, and he didn't know what to do. He had no idea what to do to stop us from making all this money, because we just basically said, well, if we do this and we do this and we do this, then there's no way not to make huge amounts of money. And you also said another thing earlier about the secondary list from the old AD&D. There was a little table. It's on page 18 or 16 or something like that. That says secondary skills, and it
Yeah,
just gives a little percentage dice. And there's 20, I think, secondary skills listed there: fisher and farmer and so on
right.
and so forth.
25. I just counted a couple days ago.
Ah, there you go. Okay, so there were 25 little things there, and no description for what any of them did.
Right.
Right, not a word in the book at all. Okay, great, you're a fisherman. We have no rules for you whatsoever about whether or not you can catch fish, and no description of, if you're not a fisherman, you can't catch fish at all. So just nothing, absolutely nothing. And
Right.
over the years, that table and the idea of wanting to develop rules for that table, that slowly became my Sage abilities list,
Yes.
which is very similar to the feats for 3.5, but it doesn't have any of the die rolls for 3.5. So
Right.
these little things that began at the beginning of the game, that I just worked and worked and worked until it ballooned into this immense project that I still work on. So yeah, I really feel a lot for those little tiny things that you find that you want to just build out into something bigger.
Well, it's a lot of fun doing that, and just like you say, it tells you nothing of what those skills do, and this is exactly what attracted me so much to second edition in the beginning, was those non-weapon proficiencies. Elaborate on those skills. They tell you exactly what they do, and well, if you have the gem cutting skill, then you can earn this much money per day of downtime working at cutting gems or whatever. So it's quite detailed in what it can do. It's third edition went nuts with spending points on stuff, and then fifth edition has something very similar to what you have, where it's just sort of this automatic proficiency increase, but it is very much die roll oriented, as opposed to more of a qualitative change. I think you get new capabilities, just like an improved chance of success with the existing
Yeah,
wizards and stuff.
the system that I've built, ultimately you become reasonably proficient in everything that class can do. You do achieve a level of proficiency no matter what the subject material is.
Mm-hmm.
Because I just assume you've been around so long, and it reminds me of people that I knew who were in various professional careers, and they could do anything within that professional career, that they weren't specialized. I was going to ask you, how much preparation do you usually do in a game? Because I work constantly on preparation.
Yeah, so preparation is basically a hobby in and of itself. But for a given session, it becomes smaller. So the preparation that I might be doing. First of all, we don't get together that frequently. I think the most frequent spacing that we ever achieve is about 3 weeks, and typically it's more like 5 or 6 weeks quite often. So it's not densely packed sessions by most standards, I think. So I have a fair amount of time in between sessions to prepare. which means I don't, or I don't prepare specifically for the session. A lot of the time I'm doing sort of general preparation. I'm messing around with some mechanic. I'm thinking about other parts of the world. I'm thinking about how I want to handle different things that are not directly related to the next session. And then the prep for the next session, for me, I have ideas percolating for a long time, really from the end of the previous session, that I don't put on paper probably until maybe 2 days before. Then I'll start to knuckle under and try to get some stuff ready. And so to be fair, I probably spend 3 hours of preparation for a 3 or 4 hour session. So it's close to 1-to-1.
Yeah, I pretty much only do a lot of preparation when I have a map that I need to introduce, something that's a dungeon or something that I know they're going to have a battle on a certain terrain. I need to have that terrain. I need to place the trees and I need to place the rocks, and I know that's going to take too long to do in the middle of a session, so I will make the map. But that's pretty much the only preparation that I will do.
Yeah.
I've pretty much got it down that anything else is plug and play. So if I have the idea, I know where the pages are that will help me flesh out that idea in a few minutes, and then I can just make that work until such time as the session ends or I get a break, and then I can fit in the little details later on.
Right. Yeah. I guess my approach is somewhat similar to that. I have a lot of ideas about things that might happen, where the characters might go, what kinds of things I think might be interesting to have intersect with them if they, go in that direction. But often I don't get to the point of turning the switch on any of that stuff until the moment they're there. So, the cat's not dead until you open the box.
Yeah. How much venturing into game material do you do that you feel makes your players uncomfortable?
Very little. We don't intentionally try to antagonize each other. And one of the things that I have done recently is, before starting a new line of adventuring with the group, is I'll do a survey. And to take an example, one of the questions on the survey for this last campaign was, level of creepiness that you enjoy, 1 to 5. And one of the respondents said, a scale of 1 to 5, 0. The other guy said, well, let me close my Call of Cthulhu book to write an answer to that. So we had the full range. Mm-hmm. But one player said 0, and for that reason, there's no creepiness going on. There's no spooky horror, undead, big dark evil thing. There are bad forces and there are evil creatures for sure, because that's what this game is about. But I haven't incorporated any kind of horror theme into any of the sessions, and I won't because of that response.
Okay, so in terms of principles, how do you feel about other subjects and keeping them just flat out of the game? Let's see, what are some of the favorites? Racism, sexuality, torture. If your players wanted to torture somebody to get information out of them, how far would you let that go? That sort of thing. Or do you, and in terms of principles in the bigger picture, how much should that be limited right across the board for everyone?
So all of that stuff is a matter of preference, right? It's more easily dealt with in the actual play than it is to try to define how it's handled. But playing with this same group of people, and I know that nobody's interested in exploring, issues of moral ambiguity through the game. Let's have white hats and black hats, and not worry about, are those orc babies? It's so we don't dig into that, and I think none of us, as middle-aged men, are particularly interested in exploring those themes through a game.
Myself, playing with people who don't hesitate to kill orc babies at will, whether or not required to do so, I tend to take more of an artistic stand on the whole issue, and I know from the blowback that I have received in the past on the subject matter, where I've written posts about sex and D&D and so on, and
Yeah.
the tremendous backlash that comes at me, and I wonder why that the subject or the venue of D&D, if we can call it that, or the venue of any role playing game, can't match the venue of a television show or a movie or a book. Why shouldn't we investigate those same subjects if we're ready to investigate them in a given film? We don't tell
Yeah.
artists don't make films about racism because nobody really wants to see them.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think if that is a theme that is of interest to you as a DM, is of interest to your players to explore, by all means. I think the blowback you get from the internet is because it's the internet, not because it has anything to do with what should or shouldn't be in D&D.
I think people go to the worst place, and they assume that if I say that, then I would force people who were playing in my game to undergo that experience.
Yeah.
And that wouldn't be my plan. I would take the same tact as you take, is that if that wasn't making any good headway on my players, then I would back right off from that and not do it. But I'm still going to feel a need to push a little, right? Like just here or there, or have something that the fellow who doesn't like the creepiness at all, it's too beneficial to the game to know that the tiniest bit of creepiness will get tension out of that particular individual, and then I want to see where I can just touch his boundaries a little and make him feel just uncomfortable enough to know that he's glad when it stops, because I always want to give that impression that you got real tense, but oh my God, the relief is so wonderful when it comes.
Right. Well, and this may be one of my shortcomings too, is creating that dramatic moment. I think is something that I have room to improve on, and that's a great example of just touching it a little, touching on something a little bit that I know is going to make them uncomfortable, because making them uncomfortable leads to that moment of relief. It can improve their feeling of success, the gratification of success at the end of an adventure, or a piece of an adventure, let's say. That's a great tool. It's a great tool that I should probably employ myself.
Well, the trick is not to be heavy-handed. You don't have to go that far. There's so many good examples of if I want to think of a torture scene that seems like a horrible, immensely powerful torture scene in a film that at least once upon a time made people universally uncomfortable, I would think about the Dustin Hoffman, Laurence Olivier scene from Marathon Man. Okay. You don't actually see anything. There's no actual torture that occurs on the screen at all. But Dustin Hoffman is sitting in a chair and he can't get out of the chair. And Laurence Olivier, who is an ex-Nazi, is calmly getting his dental tools together and repeatedly asking Dustin Hoffman the question, is it safe, without explaining what the question is about. And each time Dustin Hoffman answers, it's clear he has no idea what Olivier is talking about. And Olivier never changes from just asking the question, is it safe, is it safe, is it safe, is it safe?
Right.
And when the dental stuff starts to come, it's so benign in itself, but by then you're so set up for the scene that all you can think of is if I was in the chair and my teeth were being touched, and it just sends you right off to the... And maybe I'm bringing this up because I had my teeth worked on today. But there's lots of ways for people who are squeamish about something, and you can still just press a few buttons here or there and then take your hand off the button and let them feel, oh, good, I'm glad that's over. I'm glad we don't have to go there again. But like I say, I also run this one party which can't wait to torture people.
Yeah, you may be right. I think the other danger though when you're getting opinions from the internet like that is that you're not sitting down face to face with somebody in your living room or at the bar and having a conversation that involves facial expression and tone of voice, and seeing who this person is and so forth. You could as easily be talking to a 13-year-old kid who just is shooting mouth off with no, it's a very limiting medium. as you know. I mean, the written word is tough, and then when you have it in the really informal, off the cuff, 140 bytes format, it's even worse, right? So I see the downside too of this very, very broad access. Also means that there's a lot of junk as well as the good stuff that you might not have been able to get. There's also a lot of crap that you wish you hadn't gotten, right? So.
Oh, no, that's certainly true. I'm going to ask, have you ever thought about getting back to RPGs? Have you ever thought about quitting the game?
No, absolutely not. I mean, there have been times in my life where I haven't had the time to do it, or as much time as I'd like to do it. But no, I never think about just not doing it at all. Yeah, no, and actually, I say I don't think that. I've certainly thought about the trade-off between the amount of time it takes and what I'm getting back from it. And you know, we're talking about preparation. I said, well, it's probably about 1-to-1 for the actual session, but there's a whole lot of other prep that isn't immediate for the session prep that I'm also doing. That is probably to a good extent kind of a waste of time. You know, who really cares what crop yields were in 10th century Norway? It doesn't matter.
I can make an excellent argument for why it does, but we don't need to go down there. Now, I have one last question which I need to bring around because this is the theme for the season. Just now, my argument is more or less that people spend more time trying to solve the problems associated with RPGs and running games and so on, and not enough time actually looking at the problems themselves. What do you think of that? What are your thoughts on that?
To make sure I really understand what you're asking. So people are spending more time trying to solve the problems than they are examining what the problems are. Is that your assertion?
Yeah, to put it in another way, we're spending more time healing the patient than diagnosing the patient.
Okay. All right. Yep. Maybe. That's not the case for my group. I spend all the time trying to diagnose what can I do to make this better, and very rarely actually managing to pull anything off. So I spend a lot more time in reflection of, well, how could this be better? How could this be more fun? What are they interested in? The time I spend actually doing stuff to make it better or more interesting is probably smaller than the amount of time I think about what are those things I could be doing? What are the things that they're looking for? So I don't know. But as I say, I'm also narrowly exposed, right? I'm in this sort of insular group of people without a lot of outside influence. All long time players. I'm not, I don't have anybody who's not ever played the game coming in. We don't have a 20-year-old in the group. We're all in our 40s. So it's a
insular.
Yeah.
Don't feel bad about that. You're very lucky.
Yeah. No, I think so. I'm not
listeners here who are really
I'm
envious,
that I
right?
can't answer the question better for you, I guess.
Well, thank you, Sterling. Thank you. I appreciate you coming in and talking to us and about your game world and your insular experience, your perspective. And it's a different perspective, and I think we need to hear that. Now, today my guest has been Sterling Blake. I'm Alexis Smolensk, and you've been listening to the Authentic Role-Playing Podcast. Please use the subscriber button and subscribe. And if you're looking for more advanced content about Dungeons & Dragons and how to run the game, I suggest you visit my blog at Tao of D&D, or you buy my books, How to Run, An Advanced Guide to Managing Role-Playing Games, or The Dungeon's Front Door. Both are available on Amazon, iBooks, and Lulu. You can also visit my other blog, Tao's Masterclass, for point-by-point recommendations on how to be a better dungeon master. You can find links for all of this content and more on the description below. Now, I wish you the very best for your campaigns as you are working on them out there, and I urge you to keep listening to the podcast and keep reading and keep working on your games and making D&D a better world every day.